Margot Aldgate did not pack in anger. She folded each illustration board with the same deliberate care she had always used. Corner to corner, edges aligned, wrapped them in brown paper, and tied each bundle with the flat linen cord she kept on her work table. She had 11 finished pieces. She took them all. She left one. It was the Hedgerow series. 4 seasons of observations rendered in pencil and watercolor. The hawthorn flowering in May, the berries going dark in October, the bare gray tangle of January, and the first green pushing through in March. She had begun it the week after her wedding, working each morning at the window of the east bedroom while Crispin slept, or did not sleep, or rose early for correspondence. She had never shown it to him. He had never asked. She set it on his writing desk, unrolled and flat, weighted at the corners with the small stone she used as a paperweight. Let him look at it now. Let him understand that she had been watching something beautiful through the window of his house for 3 years. And he had never once thought to ask what she was working on. Then she slid the wedding ring from her finger and set it beside the stone. She did not leave a note. There was nothing to write that the illustration didn't already say more plainly. She had come to Crispin Aldgate the way most things came into his life, arranged, efficient, and without ceremony. Her father, a botanist at a small college in Oxford, had died in the winter of 1864 and left her the contents of his study, 4,000 pressed specimens, 12 years of field notes, and a reputation in academic circles that would open exactly no doors for a woman without income or family connection. He had also left her in the care of his old friend, Professor Harkin, and it was through Harkin's dinner table that she had met Florence Aldgate, who had a son who needed a wife before he turned 30 to satisfy the terms of his grandfather's trust, and who was, Florence had said afterward to her own circle, sensible enough not to require management. Margot had known what the word sensible meant when a woman of Florence's type used it. It meant no ambitions that would inconvenience anyone. It meant educated enough to converse, but not educated enough to disagree. It meant she would sit in a room full of important people and make the room feel pleasant, and never claim any of the importance for herself. She had told herself she could live with that. She had been wrong. The marriage had not been unkind. That was the thing she would return to in the long months that followed, when she was trying to understand what had happened. Crispin was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was present at meals and civil at gatherings, and when she mentioned her father's work, he would nod in the way people nod when they are filing information away, under a category they don't intend to open again. He had a good mind for commerce and a careful sense of social obligation, and he had given her the east bedroom with the large window and the view of the hedgerow without being asked, apparently aware on some level that she would want the light. But he had never looked at her, not in the way that meant something. She had looked at him, though. She had looked at him carefully, and honestly, the way she looked at specimens, not to find beauty necessarily, but to understand what was actually there. What she found was a man who was comfortable in his life, in the way a man can be comfortable when his life requires very little of him emotionally, when the world has arranged itself around his convenience so thoroughly that he has never needed to develop the habit of reaching toward anything that wasn't already within arm's length. She had told herself that was enough. It happened at the Pemberton dinner. The Pembertons held a large annual reception the last Thursday of October. The kind of evening that Margot had learned to navigate by finding the 2 or 3 guests who were actually interesting and staying near them until supper. She had been standing near the library door, with a woman she'd only just met, discussing a natural history collection, when she heard voices in the room beyond. The door was not fully closed. She had not intended to hear anything. "She suits you, though," the man's voice said. She recognized it. Crispin's cousin, the one who visited from Edinburgh every autumn. 3 years now. You seem settled enough." "Settled," Crispin said. "Yes, that's the right word." "Is it a good match?" A pause. Not a long one, 3 seconds at most. Margot counted each of them. "It was a sensible one," Crispin said. "She's capable. Manages the house well. Makes a decent impression at these things." He stopped. "I don't think I've ever felt anything for her, honestly. Not in that way. I'm not sure I'm built for it. But she suits the arrangement." The other man made a sound, the comfortable sound of someone who has heard what he expected to hear. Margot stepped back from the door. She went and excused herself with a headache, and she found her wrap and left the Pemberton house, and walked the 12 minutes back through the cold October dark to the Aldgate house on Warwick Street. And she did not cry, and she did not stop walking, and she did not allow herself to do anything but breathe steadily and put one foot in front of the other, until she was inside. She sat on the edge of the work chair in the east bedroom for a long time. What came was not surprise. It never does, when the thing you hear only confirms what you have known without being willing to know it. She had understood for 3 years that the warmth she was waiting for was not coming, that there was no version of patience long enough to produce from Crispin something he had never grown in himself. She had understood it and arranged her life around the understanding, and told herself it was enough to have the window, and the light and the work. It was not enough. She had deserved better than an arrangement. She had deserved someone who looked at her the way she looked at things she loved, with actual attention, with the intention of understanding what was actually there. She had spent 3 years in a house where no one asked what she was working on. By 2 in the morning, she had packed everything that was hers, not everything she had brought. She had no way to carry all of it, and no interest in taking things that had come to belong to the life rather than to her. She took the illustration boards. She took the field notes she had continued in her father's tradition. She took 3 volumes of botanical reference she had bought with her own inheritance money. She took the small framed portrait of her father that she kept on the windowsill. She set the ring beside the hedgerow series on Crispin's desk. She had written to Mr. Talbot 6 weeks earlier, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while Crispin was in meetings with his solicitor, because she had learned at her father's side that preparation was not the same thing as anticipation, that it was possible to build a door in a wall without walking through it, and wise to know the door was there. Mr. Talbot ran a natural history publishing house on Bedford Street in London. He had been her father's publisher for 12 years, and had attended the funeral, and said to her afterward, without ceremony, "Your father's work is irreplaceable, but his methods aren't. If you ever want to continue it, come and see me." His reply had come 8 days after her letter. "We are in need of an illustrator with proper training and a naturalist's eye. The position is yours when you want it. I am old enough to know that sometimes people need a door held open for a while, before they're ready to walk through." She had folded the letter and kept it in the back of her field notes, as if she hadn't already memorized every word. She took the first coach from Warwick Street to the London Road at 5:30 in the morning. The October air was sharp and clear. She did not look back at the house. Mr. Talbot was a small man with a broad forehead and ink-stained hands who had spent 40 years publishing books about the natural world and had developed, as a result, the habit of seeing things clearly and without sentimentality. He looked at Margot when she arrived on his doorstep on a gray November morning, at the portfolio under her arm, and the composed expression of a woman who had walked through a door that had cost her something, and he said, "I have a desk by the north window, the light's best there. Come in and show me what you've been doing." She showed him. He looked at the hedgerow series, all 4 seasons, for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "This is serious work. Your father taught you well." He said it matter-of-factly, the way a person states a true thing without needing to make it larger than it is. She had not expected it to affect her as much as it did. She managed to say thank you without her voice breaking. Within 3 weeks, she had a project. Within 6, she was illustrating the 2nd volume of a natural history atlas that Talbot had been working to complete for 5 years. 40 plates of British flowering plants, rendered to scientific standard with the kind of observed accuracy that comes from someone who has been looking at living things her whole life and knows the difference between what a plant looks like and what it actually is. She worked the way she had always worked, early in the mornings, methodically, with the north window light falling across the page. Once, after she'd spent 3 days on a particularly difficult specimen, the way the florets arranged themselves, the exact angle of the involucri, Talbot set his hand briefly on the edge of her desk and said, "Your eye is better than your father's was." Then he walked away before she could respond, which was, she came to understand how he delivered the things he meant most. She wrote to Crispin when she had been in London 4 weeks. The letter was brief. She had arrived. She was working. She wished him no ill. She did not explain herself. The explanation was on his writing desk, in watercolor and pencil, weighted at the corners with the small stone. She wrote again 3 weeks later. This one was longer, and she fought against making it longer and lost. She told him what she had heard at the Pemberton dinner. She told him she wasn't writing out of anger. She had passed through anger quickly, the way she moved through most things, by looking at it directly until it yielded to understanding. "I am not writing to make you feel guilty," she wrote. "I am writing because I have spent 3 years in a house where silence was the default language, and I find I am no longer interested in speaking it. I heard what I heard. I want you to know that I heard it, and that I am not a woman who can build her life on the understanding that she is a convenience. I deserved better than that. I believe you are decent enough to understand why I left." She heard nothing back. She wrote once more, 5 weeks later, shorter, quieter. A paragraph about a specimen she had found in a market stall, pressed between the pages of an old journal. She wrote it the way a person writes when they are not yet ready to stop, when the act of writing is its own separate thing from the expectation of reply. Then she stopped, not from anger, because she was finished waiting. Mrs. Pryor had found the east bedroom empty at 6:30 on the morning Margot left. The housekeeper had been with the Aldgate family for 14 years, and had developed over those years a comprehensive understanding of when things in the house had changed without anyone announcing the change. She stood in the doorway and looked at the cleared shelves and the empty windowsill, and the illustration portfolio rack standing bare as a winter tree. Then she went to find Mr. Aldgate. Crispin followed her down the hall, and stepped inside the east bedroom and looked at the empty shelves and the bare windowsill, where the portrait of her father had been. Then he went to his study. The hedgerow illustration was on his desk. He had never seen it before. He stood over it for a long moment, the 4 seasons laid out in sequence, the kind of sustained observation that required showing up to the same subject again and again over months, being changed by it, recording what changed. He looked at the January panel, the bare hawthorn, rendered with such precision he could see each individual thorn. He looked at the May panel, the small white flowers he had glanced at through the window hundreds of times, without registering as anything more than the hedgerow, being the hedgerow. He picked up the wedding ring. It was lighter than he expected. When Florence arrived, she looked at the illustration, looked at the ring in his hand, and said, in the controlled voice she used for things that required controlling, "The vicar's family has a daughter." "Mother." The word came out flat. Florence looked at him. "Not yet," he said. "Don't." He turned the ring over in his fingers. "She heard me. At the Pemberton dinner, I said things to Colin that I should never have said, and she heard them. She had reason to go." Florence was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her gloves from the hall chair and said, very carefully, that she would see him at supper. Fern arrived for her usual autumn visit, 2 weeks after Margot left. She was 9 years old, Crispin's niece from his sister in Bath, and she had the particular quality of being overlooked by adults who mistook her quietness for absence, when in fact she was simply listening. She had adored Margot since the summer 2 years ago, when Margot had sat with her in the garden and spent an entire afternoon, explaining what she was drawing and why, answering every question about the difference between a botanist and a gardener, and whether things changed when you stopped looking at them. She found the sketchbooks on the second day of her visit. She had been looking for a tin of charcoal sticks Margot had said she could use whenever she visited. The sketchbooks were stacked in their usual place on the 4th shelf. The ones Margot had filled during 3 years of the marriage, field observation journals, and working studies and preliminary sketches for finished plates. Fern carried them to Crispin's study. She set them on the desk without ceremony, the way a 9-year-old sets things down, when she has decided something is important enough to stop what she was doing and bring it immediately. Then she stood in front of the desk and said, "She filled 14 sketchbooks in 3 years, Crispin, I counted." He looked up from his ledger. "She never showed you any of them, did she?" It wasn't a question. "She told me once that the east bedroom window had the best light she'd ever had in a studio." Fern pressed her lips together. She said it was the one part of the house that felt like it was hers. She was grateful for it. She looked at him steadily. She was grateful for a window, Crispin, and she left anyway. The room was quiet. "Did you know she'd written to the publisher in London 6 weeks before she left? She had it planned. She didn't just leave, she had it ready. She was hoping she wouldn't need it." Fern paused. She was hoping the thing she was afraid of wasn't true. "Fern, I'm not angry at you," she said. "I'm just telling you what I see because no one else is going to." She turned the top sketchbook so it faced him and opened it to the first page, a field study of a wild rose from the garden, rendered in the careful observational style that was entirely Margot's. "She was paying attention to everything in this house for 3 years. And you didn't know she had 14 sketchbooks." She closed it. "I thought you should know." She left the room. Crispin sat with the sketchbooks in front of him for a very long time. He read Margot's letters that evening, both of them. He read the second one 3 times. He had not answered. He had not known what to answer with, which he recognized now was not a reason but an excuse. The comfortable choice of a man who had spent his life selecting the easiest available option and calling it pragmatism. Silence had been his easiest option. That was precisely the problem. He wrote 4 drafts of a letter over 3 evenings. He mailed the 5th. There was also the manuscript. He had known about it without knowing he knew. Margot had mentioned it twice in the early months of the marriage, a final collection of her father's field notes that had never been compiled or published, sitting in boxes at the old house in Oxford. She had said she intended to organize and illustrate it herself someday, when there was time. There was never time. Crispin wrote to Professor Harkin in Oxford. He did not explain why. He asked about the state of the field notes, whether they were still with the estate. Harkin wrote back in 10 days. The notes were still in storage. No one had touched them in 2 years. Crispin made an arrangement with the estate solicitor. He paid for the careful transfer of the boxes to Talbot's publishing house on Bedford Street in London, addressed to Margot, with no note attached. He did not sign anything that would indicate the source. He was not doing it to be recognized for it. He was doing it because the manuscript was her father's life's work, and it belonged in her hands, and because she had once, in the 2nd month of their marriage, said quietly that she was afraid the notes would be lost, and he had nodded and changed the subject. He was paying a different kind of attention now. He arrived at Talbot's on a Tuesday in February. He had written ahead to Talbot only, not to Margot. He arrived knowing she was there, and knowing she had not invited him, and making the considered decision that showing up was a more honest act than asking permission. Margot came through from the back studio. She stopped when she saw him. She looked like herself, which was different from how she had looked in the Aldgate house. Something about the way she stood. Not the careful, managed posture of a woman arranging herself for a room. Just how she stood when there was no room to manage herself for. Crispin, she said. Margot. He had rehearsed something more than her name. It had left him entirely. I came because I owe you something I couldn't put adequately in a letter. I understand if you don't want me here. I'll go if you tell me to. She looked at him for a long moment. Talbot appeared briefly in the doorway to the back studio, glanced at the scene with the particular discretion of a man who had published 40 years' worth of books about things that required patient observation, and said to Margot, without addressing Crispin at all, I have the Beaumont proofs if you need a reason to be occupied later. No urgency. Then he withdrew. Sit down then, Margot said. Say what you came to say. He sat. I heard you, he said. What I said to Colin at the Pemberton dinner. You heard it, and you were right to leave. That is the first thing. He met her eyes. I said what I said because it was what I believed at the time, or what I told myself I believed. I don't believe it now. I haven't since the morning I walked into my study and found what you'd left on my desk. She was quiet. The Hedgerow series, he said. I looked at it for a long time. I'd walked past that window for 3 years. He stopped. I didn't know about the sketchbooks, Margot. 14 of them. I didn't ask. I had a wife doing serious work in the room down the hall, and I never once asked what she was working on, and that is not something I can explain with the terms of an arrangement or the convenience of a schedule. I simply didn't look. That was my failure. Not the marriage, not the terms. Me. Margot turned her pencil over in her fingers. She was looking at her hands. Fern told me about the sketchbooks, he said. Of course she did. Something almost like a smile crossed her face. She's 9. She sees everything. She told me you'd prepared the London option 6 weeks before you left. That you'd been hoping you wouldn't need it. Margot set the pencil down. Yes. What were you hoping for? She looked at him. Something small. One question about the illustration on my desk. One time you came through the studio door just to see what I was doing. She shook her head. Something that meant I wasn't invisible in my own marriage. He held that. He did not deflect it. You weren't wrong about what you felt, he said finally. I want you to understand that I know that now. The reception for the 2nd volume of Talbot's Natural History Atlas was held in March at the Linnean Society Rooms on Piccadilly. Naturalists, scientific illustrators, fellows of the learned societies, publishers, and the peripheral crowd that attached itself to anything taking place in a room with a good address. Margot had not wanted to attend. Talbot had told her plainly that she had produced half the illustrations in the volume, and her absence would be conspicuous and wrong. She had come. The room was full by the time Crispin arrived. He found her near the botanical display cases, talking to a fellow from the Royal Society about a specimen identification. The kind of conversation that required her whole attention, which she was giving it. She did not see him come in. Talbot opened the evening remarks. He was brief, as Talbot was always brief. He spoke about the atlas, about the 5 years of work it represented, about the standard of scientific illustration in the second volume that exceeded, in his estimation, anything comparable in current publication. He named the contributors. He named Margot last, held the name a beat longer than the others, and the room applauded in the way rooms applaud when they have just registered that someone in it matters more than they had assumed. Afterward, a man from the Horticultural Society approached Crispin. They were acquainted through professional channels, and said, in the speculative tone of someone feeling out a topic, "I understand you have a connection to one of the illustrators. The Collier woman." "My wife," Crispin said, "Margot Aldgate." The man paused. I had heard there had been a separation." "You heard incorrectly," Crispin said. He kept his voice pleasant. "She is in London working on a significant project." He looked at the man steadily. "Her work is the finest botanical illustration currently being produced in England. If your society is looking for a collaborator for its Flora series, I'd recommend you speak to her directly. She's standing near the display cases." The man looked at him oddly. Then he looked across the room at Margot. "Yes," he said slowly, "I think we will." He found her in the corridor outside the main room at 9:30. She looked at him without surprise. She had seen him arrive. "You told Pemberton to speak to me," she said, "about the Flora series." "I told him you were the finest botanical illustrator currently working in England. That's a statement of fact." She studied him. "That's not a small thing to say in a room like that." "No, it isn't." He stood a few feet away. "I also want to tell you about the field notes." Her expression shifted. "They're here, at Talbot's. I arranged the transfer from Oxford in December. I didn't sign anything. I didn't want you to feel obligated to respond in any particular way." He met her eyes. "The manuscript belongs in your hands. That's all." Margot was very still. "My father's manuscript." "All of it." He paused. "You mentioned them twice in the first months of the marriage. I should have done something about it then. I didn't, because I wasn't paying the right kind of attention. I'm paying it now." She looked at him for a long time. Something worked across her face. Not softening exactly, but the particular shift of a person who has been seen in the way they needed to be seen and is deciding what to do with that. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I have built a life here that I am proud of. The atlas, the manuscript, this work. I built it myself and I intend to keep building it. Whatever happens between us has to fit around that life. It cannot be the thing that takes precedence over it." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I'm not ready to make any decisions." She held his gaze. "The evidence is better than it was. You have done specific things, not large gestures, specific and practical. Things that cost you something without advertising that they cost you something." She paused. "That matters to me. I want you to know it matters." "I know. It is not sufficient yet." "I know that too." She turned the exhibition program over in her hands. "I'll be in London until June at minimum. The manuscript will take at least a year to organize and illustrate." "London is not far from Wiltshire," he said. "No," she said, "it is not." She looked at him a moment longer. The corridor was quiet. Through the closed door behind them, the reception continued its course. "The hedgerow illustration," she said. "I want it back." He had brought it. "I'll leave it at Talbot's tomorrow morning." She nodded. She moved to go back inside. "Margot," she paused. "I'm asking for time," he said. "Not a conclusion, just the chance to show you, by what I do and don't do, that the man in the Pemberton library is not the man I intend to be." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I'm watching, Crispin," she said quietly. "I watch everything." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm counting on." The manuscript came alive slowly, the way her father's work had always operated, patiently, with the understanding that the thing being studied had its own timeline and could not be rushed. By June, Margot had organized the field notes into a workable sequence and begun the preliminary illustrations for the first section. By August, Talbot had commissioned the full volume. Crispin came to London in April, in May, in June. Not for her. He never said it was for her. There was always legitimate business, and London was not far. But he came, and he stayed long enough to be useful, and he was learning a different kind of attention. He asked about the manuscript. He asked about specimens. He asked once, carefully, whether she would walk with him through the botanical gardens at Kew, and she said yes. And they spent 4 hours there, and she told him more about her father's methodology than she had said to anyone in 3 years. and he listened without waiting for his turn to speak. Fern came to visit in July. She stayed at Talbot's with Margot for a week, bringing the bird observation journal she had been keeping since spring. She and Margot spent 2 mornings sketching in the garden of the house on Bedford Street, Fern's loose pencil lines, and Margot's precise ones filling the same pages. Crispin arrived on the 4th day of Fern's visit. He found them in the garden. He stood in the doorway for a moment before they heard him, looking at the two of them side by side with their sketchbooks, the 9-year-old, and the woman who had taught her to look at things carefully. And something in his expression was the expression of a man who understands, with sudden and irrevocable clarity, exactly what he had failed to see for 3 years, and what he intended to spend the rest of his life making right, not in apology but in practice. Fern looked up and saw him first. She said nothing, which was its own form of something. She looked back at her sketchbook and went on drawing. Margot looked up a moment later. She looked at him standing in the doorway in the July light. She looked at his expression. She had trained herself for 27 years to read what was actually there, not what she wanted to find. And what was there was real and specific, and had not been arranged for anyone's benefit. She moved over on the bench. "Sit down then," she said. "Tell me which one you think is the wild violet." He sat down. He looked at the page. "That one," he said, pointing. "Wrong, that's a vetchling." She pointed to the one beside it. "That's the violet." "They look the same to me." "They don't," she said. "You're not looking at the leaf shape." He looked at the leaf shape. He looked at it for a long time, with the new and still unfamiliar discipline of a man teaching himself to slow down and actually see what was in front of him. "You're right," he said. "I see it now." She did not say anything else, but she did not move away from the spot on the bench she had made room for. And that, in its way, was the beginning of a different kind of arrangement, built not on the convenience of two people who suited each other on paper, but on the slow and deliberate practice of a man learning to pay attention to a woman who had always deserved it, and a woman who had built enough of her own life to know exactly what she was, and was not, willing to accept. Fern finished her sketch. She held it up to the light, checking the proportion against the actual violet growing in the corner of the garden. She adjusted 2 lines. She was satisfied. Some things, when you finally look at them properly, turn out to be exactly what they are.